Welcome to the questions and answers part to the second session of our lecture on international political economy. Once again, this Q&A part will be structured in the following way. First, I will discuss some of the fields that your questions addressed oftentimes, and in the end I will then discuss a selection of individual questions, but more quickly. So first of you, many ask questions around money and banking and around those sections from the textbook, and these are very important questions, and here I just wanted to let you know that I saw those questions and that they were received, but I'm not going to answer them right here because they are actually too important to be buried in some kind of Q&A part, which is why they are going to be answered in the next proper lecture session. Secondly, many of you asked questions around whether or not Europe was special and when it was special and when it became to be special and what might have been special around it. And I think many of you did so because you were kind of surprised by me emphasizing this point of Europe not being special that often. The reason why I did emphasize this point so often was because this is typically the way people think, and particularly the way that Europeans think about history, that there was always something inherently special about Europe. And I would argue over a lot of time there really wasn't. Of course, there's always something special about every region, everyone's special, so are Europeans, but there was not much outstanding about Europe in this time that made Europeans surpass all other regions in the world of the time. But of course we have to discuss the question, when was there nothing special about Europe? I think if we talk about 1800 or 1900, it's pretty clear that Europe was probably the most productive, the most powerful, and in these senses the most advanced region in the world, dominating much of the rest of the world. So this is something that is outstanding. But we also have to ask, where did this come from? And here I would say it came from events that took place after 1400, and in the year 1400 Europe was not outstanding. And I want to make this argument a little bit longer, but also sketch how you could argue other ways. So what do we have to explain when we discuss this? The first thing we have to explain is this initial wave of European expansion beginning in the 1400s, which is particularly the Portuguese sailing down the western coast of Africa and the Spanish sailing across the Atlantic Ocean and quote-unquote discovering the Americas. And this is something that happened in the 1400s, and probably the key year, of course, is 1492 that everyone knows, when Christopher Columbus reached the Americas. And then something quite different much later happened that you would also say that's something special that we have to explain. And this is the emergence of modernity, so of modern society, of modern politics, and of modern capitalism, also in Europe, beginning probably in the late 1700s and then really coming into being in the late 1800s. And oftentimes this is viewed as a continuum, as something that is one thing, but actually it's not that much, because if you look at the Spanish and the Portuguese in the 1400s, there wasn't anything near modern about them, not in the way they were politically organized, not the way they thought, not their weaponry. There was nothing modern about Spain or Portugal in the 1400s. So these are quite different things that are of course connected, but this is not just one thing you have to explain when you want to explain European exceptionalism, as you will. And what factors do we have to explain these things? First, I would say what I already said in the lecture, that there were strong commercial interests of Europeans in trade with Asia and Africa, because Europeans had a high demand, or at least the highest the highest strata of European society had a high demand in luxury goods from Africa and Asia. So there was money to be earned there for merchants. And so there was this strong commercial interest that did not really exist the other way around. Of course, Chinese merchants also made money from this trade, but it was not as important for the Chinese to get European goods. So there was some desire to get out there. Secondly, if we really want to search for things that were special in Europe in 1400, we probably have to look at the region that today is northern Italy and the city-states that were located there. Particularly most important probably are Venice, Florence, and Genova back then. What we have there are already city-states that have some form of responsive government that were not ruled by kings and emperors, but that were ruled by governments that were not representing the society as a whole. Not the whole population could become part of that government, but that were at least responsive to claims and demands from some part of the government. It's far from what we would today call a democracy, but they were republics. We also had the emergence of banking in some ways there, or further development of banking. We had some forms of banking long time ago, but the very term bank comes from this time, and also some innovations in banking come from this time. We also have some forms of proto-capitalism back then, so we had rich individuals and rich families that had a lot of financial resources that they could invest in economic ventures. And also culturally, this was probably among the most advanced regions, definitely in Europe, but also probably in the world. So we had a high degree of literacy. A lot of people could write and read, not by today's standards, but by standards of the time. We had a high degree of urbanization. However, we didn't have the biggest cities in the world in northern Italy back then. That was not the case. But we had some kernel of what you could argue, well, this was the origin of what then flourished as European civilization in the coming centuries. If you want to subscribe to this cultural narrative, then probably the Italian city-states is the place where you have to look. However, you also must see that this is not actually where European expansion started. The Venetians, they had some colonies, but they were mostly in Europe and some trading posts at the northern African coast of the Mediterranean. So this was not what we typically think about when we think about European expansion. Then we could also argue that the Black Death, which of course was a horrible event, might also have been a driver in bringing about social change and maybe changes in thinking and ideology. Because at that time, you must remember that probably about 1/3 of the European population died. In some areas, maybe even 2/3 of the population. So you can imagine that this might have changed the way people thought. It might have lowered their trust in divine authorities. It might have encouraged them to think about the world they have to live in, and it might have encouraged them to take fate into their own hand. So this is an argument that you could make that was important back then. Then you could also argue that some developments at the margins of Europe were also important. So we had, for roughly 1,000 years, we had the Byzantine Empire at the eastern end of what was then Europe. So it was the eastern half of the Roman Empire that then was split up, and it was focused around what is today Istanbul. It was then Constantinople, and this was a rather stable and important political entity, and it began to decline at the end of the Crusades, and so it began to decline probably around 1200, and then it fell apart in 1453 when the Turks conquered Constantinople/Istanbul. And this decline caused many thinkers from this area to migrate to Europe, and particularly migrate to the northern Italian city-states, bringing with them knowledge of ancient philosophies, of ancient thinking that were mainly lost in much of Europe. So this might also have contributed. And then we had beginning probably around 1400. You can also find some first beginnings of it maybe in the 1200s or 1300s, but typically the beginning date is given as around 1400, the European Renaissance, or more specifically the Italian Renaissance. And this is exactly something that happened in the Italian city-states and was probably partly helped by people from the Byzantine Empire arriving there. And what we have there is probably the core of the cultural narrative of European success. Because you remember from the textbook that O'Brien Williams distinguished these two narratives about European exceptionalism. One is this cultural story where authors argue that Europeans were so advanced and creative in their kind of thinking, and this is why there was so much technological and social progress there that they came to shape the world. On the other hand, we have this much more gloomy story about Europeans just being more cruel and more exploitative than others and thereby coming to rule the world. And if you subscribe to this cultural story, it's all about human beings finally seeing themselves as the core of the world and not looking at some divine authority, but taking fate into their own hand, not subscribing to old dogma, what the world is like, but rather doing research to find out what the world is like and all these kind of things. And you find all that in the Italian Renaissance. They find a recentering of thinking about human beings. And so if you subscribe to this cultural story, then this is probably the place where you have to look at. However, once again, this is not where European expansion started. Of course, you can argue that Christopher Columbus, who then sailed to the Americas, that he was coming from there, and that might be a valid case. And it might also be a valid case that this strongly influenced later developments, and certainly the Renaissance did influence ideational change in Europe. So if you make this case, this is probably where you want to look. And then you also have to look at the invention of the printing press. But here you also have to see that the printing press was probably invented in 1450 in Europe, in Mayence. However, it was already there in other parts of the world. So we had printed books in China and in Korea much earlier. So while the printing press certainly contributed to Europe changing in a certain way, it's not something that was never there before. However, all these factors combined might have worked out in a different way than they did in China. Then we can also look at the other end of Europe, so not the end where the Byzantine Empire fell, but rather at the western end on the Iberian Peninsula, so what is today Spain and Portugal, where the last parts that were still ruled by Muslim rulers, particularly in the south of what is today Spain, were conquered by Christian rulers. And this process, it went over a couple of hundred of years, from the whole peninsula being dominated by Muslim rulers to the whole peninsula being dominated by Christian rulers, and it was finished in 1492, which is of course exactly the same year that Christopher Columbus finished his journey over the Atlantic. And this might also have contributed. There you have Christian rulers making the experience that they can conquer land from others. You had maybe some degree of religious zeal then, and certainly it was exactly from this peninsula where the original European expansion started. So you can argue this was one factor that contributed. And then after the 1500s, and this was also something a lot of you asked about, also the religious landscape shifted drastically. We had the Reformation, and in Germany we typically think about Martin Luther and his 95 Theses of 1517, but around the same time we also had developments in Switzerland, or what is today Switzerland in particular. We had Calvinism, we had Zwingli, then we had the separation of the Anglican Church in England from the church in Rome. So then we had Reformation, and this was once again a shift in thinking that had something to do probably with the Renaissance. And again, it's about focusing on this world, focusing on individuals, focusing on human beings, maybe reading the sacred text themselves instead of just believing in some authority. And this also created a certain political dynamic and also a catastrophic dynamic. We had the 30 Years' War, which in some parts of what is today Germany was at least as bad as the Black Death was, with in some areas 2/3 of the population dying. So this was horrible. But also then the end of the 30 Years' War was the beginning of the modern state system. So it certainly had some contribution there. And it also contributed to some of the expansion via the Atlantic with religious minorities maybe not seeking religious freedom, but at least trying to escape religious persecution. And so all these factors somehow played together, and then this also then again changed the world, so that the resources that came over from the Americas and from this trade colonialism, they were once again probably reinforcing this dynamic that was already happening in Europe. So what was first to be explained then also becomes part of this explanation. So this is just my short attempt to explain what might have been special about Europe here. But once again, you see there are a lot of uncertainties here, and you have to argue about it, and you can make this case about European culture being very special, but then you have to be cautious that you don't take anything special as something that being the special thing about Europe that was also there in China or Korea or wherever in the world. And some of you also mentioned, well, if there was nothing special about Europe, how come there were all these great technological innovations in Europe, like the compass, like the printing press, like the guns? But all of these things were there in China before they were there in Europe, and they were invented in China and then probably traveled as inventions around the world. So the Chinese had gunpowders and had guns long before the Europeans had, and then Indians had them, Arabs had, or Middle Eastern societies had them, and then they arrived in Europe. And probably something similar is true for the compass needle. And so don't make those things to be the core of European exceptionalism that were actually not exceptional. Some of you also wondered about what I said about causality, conditionality, and past dependency. And I don't want to go in this too deep, because this is not a lecture on formal logics, but a lecture on international political economy. However, I don't want to shy away from the questions. What's important here is that we have to distinguish two layers. So first we have what we can observe. So when we look at historical sources, at historical events, there are some things that we can observe that they were there. So we see certain events like the beginning of a war or a disease or something like that. We can see structures like a certain form of the economy or a certain political form. We can see just individual facts like person A was born on that and that date. We can see certain changes, like maybe some society changing from a monarchy to a republic. We can see coincidences that when this happened, also some things in the economy changed. And then we also can see the discourses of the time. So we can see how did the people in the 30 Years' War describe the 30 Years' War. And these are all things that we can observe. However, we can never observe directly causality, conditionality, and past dependency, these things. These are always our interpretations of the observations that we make. So we have things that we see, and they are not by themselves connected in any kind of way, but we have to make this connection. And we have to make this connection by organizing our observations, and here's of course once again where theory comes into play. And then we have to make interpretations and argumentations, and then we have to check the plausibility of certain ways in which they might be connected. And all these other things that I named in the session are part of these kinds of interpretation. And so what are they, really quickly? So if we talk about causation, we have some kind of connection in mind where A is a very active thing, so this is the cause, and then on the other hand we have the effect, which is a passive thing. So it's a very strong idea of activity and passivity, and then we have the causation, and this does something to the thing that is affected, and so it's a clear relation of two things where A causes B. This means if A happens, then B will happen, and it happens because of A. So it's not just the coincidence, but then we observe a coincidence and say, well, because of A did B happen. And here we have it much harder in the social sciences and in historical observations than the natural sciences have it, because they can do experiments. They can say, okay, let's see this virus grow in this petri dish, reproduce in this petri dish, and now we add this medication, and then we see whether it will still grow. And they can do these kinds of experiments. We can't do that. We can say, well, let's look at the Italian city-states developing without the Black Death. We cannot do that. We only have things happening once, and we cannot really influence these things happening. So we just can interpret things that have happened, and we can't do real experiments here. So there we are in the disadvantage, and this is one of the reasons why we always have more different interpretations in our fields of study than, say, physicists or biologists have in their field of study. Second, after causation, we have conditionality. And this is in some ways similar connection, but you think about it another way, and you think about it probably a little bit weaker, and your claim is not as far-reaching as the claim for causality. Typically, you discern two kinds of conditionality. One is necessary conditionality, where in order for B to happen, A must have happened first. So then there is something that's necessary. As I argued before, in order for the United States to be founded, Europeans had to come to the Americas, and there will be hardly anyone who argue about this. But then would you say Europeans arriving in the Americas caused the United States to be founded? So did Christopher Columbus and his crew stepping on some island in the Caribbean really cause the United States to be founded? Probably wouldn't argue this way. So this is necessary condition. And then you also have sufficient conditionality. And something is a sufficient condition of something else if whenever A happens, B also happens. Then it is sufficient. This seems very clear-cut, but if you think about it longer, then you will find that the connection between necessary and sufficient condition is quite complicated. But again, this is not a seminar on formal logics, so if you want to know more about it, just read the Wikipedia page on it. Maybe one more sentence to be added here is that although now it might seem like causation and sufficient conditionality are the same things, I don't want to go into much deeper, but they're not actually the same thing, because when you say something is a sufficient condition for something, you're not always saying this was also the cause. I don't want to go into this any deeper. Again, read the Wikipedia page or buy a book on formal logics if you're interested in these things. The next concept, which is actually quite important in political science, is path dependency. And you can really think about this by spelling out the metaphor of a path. So the idea is you go down a path and then you arrive at certain junctions. And at this junction, you have to decide whether you're going to take one side or the other side. So A is the junction, and then you can go down path B or path C. And after you make this decision sticks with you. And you cannot very easily go switch the other parts, because maybe between the two parts there is a mountain. In this case, there's only my head, but typically maybe there's a mountain or there's a forest or a swamp that you cannot go through. So after you decided for one path, you cannot easily switch to the other path. For example, maybe when you finished high school, you thought about studying, and then you were interested maybe in political science, but maybe you were also interested in economics and chemistry. And then you had to decide for one of these three paths. And maybe you were really equally torn between all of these things. And then you just, I don't know, went out with a friend in the evening, and then you encountered some chemist that you really liked, and this chemist explained how great chemistry is. And then you said, well, I really want to do chemistry now. And then you started studying chemistry, and then you did so for 1 or 2 years. And then you decided at this junction to take one path. And then you cannot simply go back and say, well, now I continue finishing political science, because you were not there. So you can kind of go back the path and then change there, but some decisions were made and they cannot easily be revised, but they can be revised only at a rather high cost. And you can see similar things in the way institutions are formed. There are, for example, various ways in which the interaction between banking and companies work in certain countries. They work different in the United States than they work in Germany, than they work in Japan. And all of these systems kind of work in their way, and they developed at a certain point in time in their way. And once these institutional systems are there, you cannot simply change from one to the other, because this would be associated with very high cost. And so all these societies just kind of go down their path they once have taken. But at the beginning of the path, there was no real reason for one of these paths. It just so happened. But once you're there, and there's nothing distinct about German that make them having this German system of banking and business. It just so happened here, and it could have happened otherwise, but now we have what we have. And finally, the last thing you can think about in this way are reasons or motivations. And then you're not really thinking of this like you would think maybe in the natural sciences, like one thing causes the other or is a condition of the other. But then you ask, well, what do the actors name as their rationale for doing something? What were their motivations? Why did they do this? And this does not always have to be the same thing. So an actor might say, well, I went on the sailing ship to explore the world because I want to serve the glory of God. And then this was his personal motivation, possibly. However, if you as a social scientist think about, okay, how could this thing happen? You probably not think about the glory of God, or you maybe probably think about it only as one factor. You also have to think about, well, this journey was caused by a society having the means, and probably the king or some rich business person having the resources to make all this happen. And then what the individual motivation or the reasons were might only be one factor, but it's something that you also want to look at.